He was a hero, an orphan who dreamed of becoming Hawkeye, a boy with a pure heart. But what if tragedy transformed the brightest hope into absolute hatred, capable of plunging the world into a perfect illusion? Get ready to uncover the story of Obito Uchiha, a name that, from now on, you'll see with different eyes. Amidst the turbulence of the Third Great Shinobi War, Obito Uchiha was a unique figure in Konoha. An orphan, a member of the legendary Uchiha clan, he carried the burden and potential of his legacy, yet chose a different path from his arrogant peers. Obito was clumsy, somewhat naive, and above all, a dreamer. His greatest desire? To become Hawkeye, the supreme leader of the Leaf Village, and thus finally be recognized and admired by all. He lived in the shadow of Kakashi Haddock, his prodigy teammate, and harbored an unrequited crush on his companion, Rin Nohara. The dynamic of Team Minato, under the tutelage of the future fourth Hawkeye, Minato Namikaze, was one of camaraderie, healthy rivalry, and a promising future. Obito, with his extroverted and somewhat awkward personality, was the perfect counterpoint to Kakashi's seriousness and Rin's kindness. The shinobi world, however, was a cauldron of conflict, where life and death intertwined in ceaseless battles. War was a constant, shaping generations and dictating destinies. Even in this brutal scenario, Obito kept his flame alive, his unwavering belief in the value of bonds and the power of teamwork. He believed that true strength lay not just in individual power, but in unity and sacrifice for comrades. This idealism, however, was a double-edged sword, a vulnerability in a world that showed no mercy. His resilience and optimism, characteristics that set him apart, would be tested in unimaginable ways. His mind, still forming, absorbed Konoha's values, but was also susceptible to the dark truths of war. Developmental psychology shows us that traumatic experiences in childhood can shape an individual's perception of the world, making them more prone to internalizing negative beliefs or developing defense mechanisms. For Obito, the purity of his heart made him especially vulnerable to the impact of great losses. His innocence was about to collide with the brutality of reality, and cracks would begin to appear in his soul, long before he even realized the extent of the danger. There was a hidden fragility in his apparent joviality that, to the more observant, could have been a premonition. But something was coming that no one saw. An event that would redefine everything Obito believed. The turn in Obito's destiny was as abrupt as it was devastating, a blow that tore the fabric of his reality. During a crucial mission, he was trapped under a rock, on the verge of being crushed. In an act of unwavering altruism, and after awakening his Sharingan to protect the Kakashi, Obito sacrificed half of his body to save his comrades. Asking Kakashi to protect Rin, he was presumed dead, his name etched on a hero's gravestone, an empty tribute to a life he believed had ended. However, what no one knew was that he was rescued by Madara Uchiha, a legendary and sinister figure who brought him to an underground hideout. There, Obito underwent a painful and prolonged recovery process, his body largely reconstructed with Hashirama Senju cells, granting him immense regenerative power. Madara, with his cynical and distorted view of the world, began to sow the seeds of disbelief in Obito's vulnerable mind. He argued that reality was a cycle of war, hatred, and despair, and that the only way to achieve true peace was through the perfect illusion of the Eye of the Moon plan. Obito, weakened and isolated, initially resisted, clinging to the hope of reuniting with his friends and to the belief in Konoha's ideals. The internal conflict was palpable, gratitude for his salvation versus distrust of Madara's intentions. Externally, he was trapped, cut off from the outside world, his return to Konoha seeming impossible, a physical impediment that became a mental prison. Psychologically, Obito was in a state of denial and anticipatory grief. Attachment theory, in this context, suggests that the traumatic separation from his most significant bonds, Kakashi and Rin, opened a deep wound, generating a feeling of abandonment and helplessness. The isolation imposed by Madara deprived him of any social support, making him more susceptible to manipulation. Cognitive dissonance, a state of mental discomfort caused by contradictory beliefs, began to set in. Obito wanted to believe in good, but the new reality imposed by Madara pushed him into the abyss of despair, forcing him to confront a brutality he never imagined. Madara, a master of psychological manipulation, exploited this vulnerability, providing him with an alternative narrative for his death and the supposed failure of his friends to rescue him, painting a picture of betrayal and neglect. The final trigger, the point of no return, came when Obito witnessed Kakashi killing Rin. The sight of his beloved, whom he had sworn to protect, dying at the hands of his best friend, was the catalyst for a complete rupture with his old identity. His Manjihyo Sharingan awakened, and with it, a torrent of hatred and despair that obliterated any last shred of hope. His dreams, his bonds, his beliefs, everything disintegrated before his eyes, leaving behind only a void filled with darkness. And that's where everything began to crumble. The hero died, and a new being was born from his ashes. The sight of Rin's death didn't just break Obito. It pulverized his soul and irreversibly reshaped his perception of reality. The childish idealism that once motivated him was subverted by a terrifying conclusion. This world was inherently flawed, an endless cycle of pain and betrayal, and the only way to avoid suffering was by creating a perfect illusion. His mind, once a beacon of hope and altruism, became a distorted labyrinth, where pain transformed into a justification for absolute tyranny. From this point on, Obito, now operating under the alias Tobi, and later revealing himself as Madara Uchiha to the ninja world, began to craft his plans with chilling calculation and terrifying determination. His words and actions reflected this new philosophy, imbued with a deep cynicism and a resignation to the truth Madara had presented him. He no longer sought peace through teamwork or individual sacrifice. His goal was peace through total control, the imposition of a dream that would abolish the pain of loss and the illusion of freedom. For him, the end justified the most brutal and inhumane means. The Akatsuki, an organization initially formed by idealists seeking peace, was subverted and instrumentalized to collect the tailed beasts, essential for the Eye of the Moon Plan. Obito didn't see his actions as evil, but as a pragmatic necessity and a moral imperative. The cruelty of his deeds, such as the manipulation of Yahiko and Nagato, and the devastating attack on Konoha, were merely calculated steps toward a larger objective: the salvation of the world through the annihilation of individual will and the creation of a forced utopia. To enter Obito's mind at this stage is like observing an engineer constructing a complex and lethal structure from emotional rubble. He wasn't a rampaging madman. He was a strategist who had rationalized his pain until it became an unyielding doctrine. Trauma psychology explains how extreme events can lead to a complete reinterpretation of reality, where psychological defense manifests through mechanisms like dissociation and projection. Obito completely dissociated himself from the Obito of the past, the naive, dreaming boy, projecting his pain and anger onto the shinobi system itself and the inherent imperfection of the world. He had forged a new identity, an impenetrable shield against the consuming pain. Analogously, we can compare his mind to a cyber defense system that has been corrupted and reprogrammed. The original objective remains, but the method has been radically altered for absolute control and the eradication of any perceived threat to his new peace. He saw himself as the only one capable of saving humanity from itself, from an endless cycle of hatred that he had experienced firsthand. The unwavering belief that he was right, despite evidence to the contrary and the suffering he caused, is a common trait in individuals with delusions of grandeur or those who become leaders of extremist movements. For Obito, Rin's death wasn't an accident, but irrefutable proof of the world's inherent failure, the validation that chaos was the norm, and the true monster was still dormant, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself in its full fury. The point of no return for Obito was undoubtedly the moment he publicly assumed the identity of Madara Uchiha and openly declared the Fourth Great Ninja War. This was not just an act of aggression. It was a declaration of war against reality itself, a visceral denial of hope, freedom, and human individuality. By summoning the powers of the tailed beasts and aligning himself with Kabuto and the Edo Tensei, he committed a total transgression against the values he once upheld, crossing a line from which there was no possible return. He transitioned from Madara's secret agent to the executor of his grand and destructive plan, taking responsibility for a conflict that would claim thousands of innocent lives. His worldview had changed irreversibly and completely. The concept of peace for Obito was not harmonious coexistence between nations or the overcoming of differences. It was the complete eradication of all pain through the infinite Tsukuyomi. For him, individual freedom and the choices that lead to suffering were inherent flaws in existence, intrinsic defects in human nature. The only solution in his distorted mind was a world where everyone was trapped in a perfect dream, without loss, without hatred, without pain. He fervently believed that suffering was universal and inevitable in the real world, and that his solution was the only true salvation, the only way to achieve lasting utopia. At this stage, Obito's morality and ethics became completely distorted, shaped by his own pain and Madara's twisted logic. He rationalized his brutal actions as necessary sacrifices for a greater good, an objective that would transcend the misery of the real world. The deaths of his own former comrades, the manipulation of innocents, and mass destruction were justified in his mind as crucial steps toward achieving true peace. He openly challenged the logic of the shinobi who fought against him, asking them why they persisted in a world of pain and loss when he offered a suffering-free utopia, a definitive escape from reality. To bring the viewer into the dilemma of, what if he's right, is deeply unsettling and uncomfortable. Pain is universal. Losing a loved one is a reality everyone faces. What if the only way to avoid this pain was to live in a dream where loss and suffering never existed? Obito's proposal, however distorted, touched upon a dark truth about the human condition, the desire to escape pain. This question made him a complex villain, not just a mere agent of evil, but someone who, in his madness, offered a shadowy form of salvation. He questioned the very foundation of existence, forcing everyone to confront their deepest fears and the fragility of their own convictions. The question that hung in the air was, how far would you go to escape pain? And if the cost was reality itself, he wasn't just fighting a war. He was waging a philosophical battle for the nature of existence. Obito's mind, at this stage, wasn't simply insane. It was governed by a perverse and unyielding logic, meticulously constructed upon the ruins of his trauma. Delving into psychological analysis, his behavior can be understood through the lens of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, which arises from prolonged and repetitive traumas. The experience of being presumed dead, forced isolation, Madara's constant manipulation, and finally, Rin's death before his eyes, a tragedy staged to maximize its impact, created an alternative reality within his psyche. He developed a nihilistic worldview where everything was futile and meaningless, except for the pursuit of peace through the illusion of the infinite Tsukuyomi. Pain became his sole truth, and the eradication of that pain his sole purpose. His actions made sense within his own thought structure, a closed and self-justifying belief system. The collection of the tailed beasts, the terrorist attacks, and the declaration of war were merely programmatic steps to activate the infinite Tsukuyomi. It wasn't personal vengeance in a trivial sense, but the execution of a salvation protocol that he believed was the only path. The theory of rationalization, a psychological defense mechanism, is evident in each of his choices. He justified the pain he caused as a means to a greater end, denying himself guilt for his actions. He was the savior who needed to destroy to rebuild, the messianic figure of his own personal tragedy, convinced he was offering humanity's only possible salvation. Studies on ideological radicalization and cult formation show striking parallels with Obito's case. Individuals who feel betrayed or abandoned by their former belief systems can become extremely susceptible to alternative ideologies that promise a definitive solution to their suffering. Madara acted as the guru who filled Obito's existential void, offering him a purpose, a plan, and a path to correct the world. Social isolation and the lack of counterpoints to this new ideology strengthened his conviction, transforming him into a loyal follower and, eventually, a fanatical leader. The brainwashing was so profound that he became an extension of Madara's will, losing his own identity in the process. Comparatively, Obito shares traits with historical figures who became tyrants or leaders of destructive movements, convinced that their actions, however cruel, were for the greater good of humanity. Consider characters like Thanos from Avengers, who believed genocide was necessary to balance the universe and prevent scarcity, or even real-life historical figures who justified atrocities in the name of an ideological utopia. The horror of Obito's situation wasn't madness itself, but the cold, relentless logic behind each of his actions. He wasn't an uncontrollable demon, but a man who had built an architecture of destruction based on his deepest pain, a brilliant and strategic mind used for a terrifying end. It wasn't madness. It was cold calculation, forged in the fire of tragedy. The trail of destruction left by Obito Uchiha is immeasurable, and its reverberations echo throughout the entire shinobi world. The Fourth Great Ninja War claimed thousands of lives, tore families apart, devastated landscapes, and left deep scars on the collective psyche. His legacy is not just one of physical destruction, but also of the erosion of trust between nations and the establishment of a palpable fear that the cycle of hatred is, in fact, inevitable, a cycle he himself perpetuated in his attempt to end it. Even after his eventual redemption and death, the impact of his actions resonated, shaping future events and the mindset of new generations of ninja who had to learn to live with the consequences of his madness. The discussion of the real or fictional consequences of Obito's war leads us to reflect on the fragility of peace and the ease with which despair can take root and transform into a destructive movement. The destruction he orchestrated forced all the Kage and villages to unite in an unprecedented alliance, showing that, sometimes, an existential threat on a global scale is necessary to overcome secular differences and historical rivalries. Paradoxically, his hatred, though devastating, ultimately generated a unity that for a time seemed unbreakable, demonstrating humanity's capacity to unite in the face of extreme danger. The philosophical reflection that emerges from Obito's arc is profound and unsettling. Who are we to judge? Although his actions were catastrophic and morally reprehensible, the origin of his pain was genuine and universally understandable. He was, in many respects, a product of a world of endless wars and incessant losses, and his solution, though distorted and brutal, stemmed from a desperate desire to eliminate the suffering that had broken him. The question isn't whether his methods were wrong. They unequivocally were causing more pain than they ever healed, but rather whether the society in which he lived didn't fundamentally contribute to his downfall. The inability to protect Rin, the failure to prevent war, the pursuit of power, all these are part of the cycle he wanted to break. Yet, ironically, he reinforced by becoming an agent of chaos. His story is a modern myth about the danger of idealism corrupted by pain, of unprocessed pain that turns into poison, and of manipulation that can lead to ruin. Obito represents the monster that war can create, but also the human being who, even in the deepest abyss, still yearns for some form of love, recognition, and, above all, peace. He became the symbol of how love, when lost so brutally and without the necessary support, can transform into the most potent of destructive forces. His death did not completely end the cycle of tragedies or the possibility of new conflicts, for the seed of hatred and illusion, once planted in people's hearts, is terribly difficult to eradicate. But perhaps he was not the last to walk this dark path. Obito Uchiha's saga forces us to confront the cost of war and the fragility of hope. His lost love became the weapon of his own self-destruction, transforming the dream of a perfect world into a collective nightmare. The truth is, the monster he became wasn't born of pure evil, but of unbearable pain and the absence of a safe harbor. And the question that remains, echoing in the silence he left behind, is, how many more Obitos will the world create before finding true peace? Or is humanity destined to repeat its mistakes, always seeking a utopia that can only be achieved through destruction?